The first winter we were married, the temperature dropped below zero for 9 nights straight. And on every one of those 9 nights, my husband demanded the same thing from me before the lamp went out. And I gave it to him, every time. Because in my community, a wife did not say no to this. A wife was not even told she was allowed to wonder whether she could. I was 19. The bedroom was so cold I could see my own breath above the quilt. The water in the wash basin had a skin of ice across the top of it by morning. And I lay there in the dark, beside a man I had been married to for 2 months, doing the thing he asked, the thing his father had asked of his mother, the thing that every husband in our church district asked of every wife when the cold came down off the fields and pressed itself against the windows. Before I go any further, my name is Martha, and this is Hannah the Amish girl. I grew up old order Amish in a small settlement, and now I share the stories we were raised to keep behind closed doors. If you value hearing the truth about plain life from a woman who actually lived inside it, subscribe and tap the like button, and tell me in the comments, what do you imagine an Amish husband is allowed to ask of his wife in the dead of winter? I want to read your guesses, because almost no one guesses right. Here is what people outside the community do not understand. In an Amish marriage, the word demand does not sound the way it sounds to you. You picture something harsh, something cruel. But the demands in our world were woven into duty so tightly that you could not see where obedience ended and love began. A wife yields, a husband leads. That was not a suggestion. It was the architecture of the entire house. And in winter, that architecture had a particular shape. Let me explain how a marriage begins in a place like mine, so you understand the woman I was on those 9 cold nights. School ends at the 8th grade. At 14, your books close and they do not open again. After that, your education is the stove, the garden, the sewing needle, the younger children. By 16, you are going to the Sunday singings where courtship quietly begins. By 18, 19, you are someone's wife. My courtship lasted 5 months. I married Amos in November, the way nearly all of us marry, after the harvest is in, and the work has slowed enough to feed 300 guests. I knew how to can 200 jars of peaches. I knew how to deliver a calf in the dark. I did not know the first thing about what a man and a woman owe each other when the door finally closes. Our wedding was on a Tuesday. I had been awake since 4 that morning. By the time Amos and I were alone, my feet ached, my face hurt from smiling, and underneath all of it ran a fear I had no words for. Not the fear of something I understood, but the fear of something coming toward me in the dark that no one had ever described. But this story is not really about our wedding night. This story is about the winters that came after, because the wedding night every girl at least knows is coming. The winters no one warns you about at all. Here is what my husband demanded on those cold nights. He demanded that I be the one to get up first. In our house, the fire went out by 2 or 3 in the morning. The bedrooms had no heat of their own. And it was understood, never spoken, only understood, that the wife rose into the cold before the husband woke, went down the freezing stairs in the dark, and started the stove so that the house would be warm by the time he came down to begin his day. My bare feet on board so cold, they felt wet. My hands shaking too hard to strike the match the first time, or the second. The kitchen black except for the small orange mouth of the firebox once it finally caught. That was the demand. Warmth. He demanded warmth, and I was the one expected to produce it from nothing every single morning, while he slept the last 30 minutes that I would never get back. And on the coldest nights, there was a second demand. He would reach for me in the dark, not out of tenderness, but because a body gives off heat, and mine was the body that was there. I was a wife. I was warmth. I was the thing that stood between him and the cold, and it did not occur to either of us that I might be cold too. That I might also be lying there with my breath hanging white above me, wanting someone to warm me for once instead of being the warmth myself. I want to be completely honest with you about something, because it took me years of therapy to even see it clearly. Amos was not cruel. He was not a hard man. He He did exactly what his father had done, and his father before him. He had never once been told there was another way to be a husband. The demand did not come from him. It came from a system that handed both of us our roles the moment the bishop said the words, and never let either of us ask whether the roles fit. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here. Not on this platform, not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are. So I wrote the rest down instead, slowly, without the softening, without the cuts, everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. Now let me tell you about my friend Rebecca, because what happened to her is how I finally understood what was happening to me. Rebecca married 3 years before I did. She lived 2 farms over, and on quilting days we would whisper in the corner the way women in my world passed everything important. Sideways, low, never looking up from the stitching. One winter morning, she came to the frolic with her hands raw and split open at the knuckles, the skin cracked from cold and lie and never once being allowed to heal. I asked her what happened. She said her husband liked the wash done early, before light, in water she drew from the pump in the yard before the sun was up. Every morning, all winter, her hands in that water in that cold. I said, "Can you not heat the water first?" She looked at me like I had spoken a foreign language. She said, "He likes it done before he wakes." As if that settled it. As if her hands were simply the cost of his preference and there was nothing to discuss. And I remember the exact moment, standing there with my needle, when something cold moved through me that had nothing to do with the weather. Because I realized I had a version of Rebecca's hands. Mine were my feet on the frozen stairs every morning. Mine were the heat pulled out of my own body on the worst nights. We all had a version of it. Every wife in that room had quietly agreed to give something up, so that a man would not have to be uncomfortable. And not one of us had ever been asked. We had only ever been told by the silence itself that this was what a good wife did. That is the part that still sits heavy in me. The demands were never shouted. There was no villain standing over us. The demands lived in the quiet, in the things no one said. In the way my mother rose first into the cold for 40 years and never once mentioned it, so that I would not know it was a thing a person could mention. Here is what nobody outside understands about a system like that. Control does not always look like a locked door or a raised hand. Sometimes control looks like never being given the words to describe what is being asked of you. You cannot refuse a demand you have been taught to see as simply the weather. You cannot say no to something you have never been allowed to recognize as a request. In the more conservative settlements, the rules around a wife's place are stricter still. In some of the newer communities, there may be a little more give, a little more conversation between a husband and a wife about what each of them needs. But in my old order district, the expectation was as plain as the dresses we wore. The husband's comfort was the temperature of the house. The wife's comfort was not measured at all. It was not that anyone decided it did not matter. It was that no one had ever thought to ask the question, and I did not think to ask it either. For years. I rose first. I gave the warmth. I cracked my own version of Rebecca's knuckles on the cold every single winter morning, and I told myself this was love, because it was the only shape love had ever been allowed to take in front of me. But I want to tell you about the night something shifted. Because it was small, and that is exactly why it mattered. It was the 3rd winter. Below 0 again. The fire was out, and I woke in the dark to the cold the way I always did, already bracing my feet for the boards. And Amos stirred beside me, and for the first time in our marriage he said, "Stay." He said, "I will go down this time. I will start it." I lay there in the dark, and I did not move. And I listened to my husband's feet hit the freezing floor instead of mine, and I heard him go down the stairs and strike the match, and I felt the smallest warmth come up through the boards that I had not made myself. And I cried. Quietly, so he would not hear. Not because it was such a great thing. It was a fire, It was 30 minutes. But because it had taken 3 years for either of us to imagine that the warmth could come from him too, that the demand could go the other way, that a wife was allowed to be the one who was kept warm, we never spoke of it again. That was not our way. But after that, sometimes it was him, and sometimes it was me, and the difference between those two things is the whole reason I am sitting here talking to you now. When I finally left, the cost came all at once. The shunning. The letters returned unopened. My mother's silence on the telephone when I called, a silence I could feel filling the line. My family's door closed to me in a way I am not sure will ever open again. I do not say this to make you pity me. I say it because I need you to understand that the price of asking the question, of even learning that there was a question, was everything I had ever known. In therapy, years later, I learned words I had never once heard spoken out loud inside that world. Reciprocity. Boundaries. The idea that need is not a thing only one person in a marriage is permitted to have. My therapist said something I have carried with me every day since. She said, a demand that is never named does not stop being a demand. It only stops being something you are allowed to refuse. And I grieve the girl who rose into that cold every morning believing it was simply what her body was for. They told us marriage made us adults. But adulthood is not only duty and labor and a warm house produced by a wife's frozen hands before dawn. Adulthood is being allowed to say, I am cold, too. It is being allowed to imagine the warmth coming back toward you. I do not look back at Amos with hatred. We were two young people handed a set of demands neither of us wrote, trying to love each other inside rules that left no room to ask what love should cost. The plain world gave me a community with a depth most people will never feel. It gave me a faith that I have wounded and rebuilt and still hold. But it also taught me that a good wife is a warm one, and never once asked who was keeping her warm. If you grew up somewhere that called your silence obedience, I see you. If you were taught that your discomfort was simply the weather, simply the cost, simply what your body was for, you are not alone, and you were never wrong to want something different. I was not too young to keep a whole house warm through 9 nights below zero. I was too young to know I was allowed to ask for warmth in return. If this story moved something in you, tell me in the comments what part stayed with you. And if you want to hear more honest stories from behind the prayer cap, subscribe to Hannah the Amish Girl. There is still so much I have not said. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in the Ordnung they never wrote down. First comment of this video. And that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely, they might just save your life.